Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, srce Tita, rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srce Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 14th of February, and the year is, of course, 2024, and we are doing the live stream tonight on the always entertaining subject of, the semi-autobiographical, actually, no, not semi, just autobiographical story of my political journey from Trotskyism to Marxist-Leninism. And it's a political journey that took place over really fits and starts over the last 6 years. And it is, of course, interesting to walk through these details and draw appropriate political lessons from it. And if you go back on the archive of the old Red Star Radio broadcast that I used to do jointly with my former co-host Layla, you can actually hear me on there giving Trotskyite defenses in the early to middle period before fully abandoning Trotskyism in the later period of that program. So we're here tonight to talk about why that was and what led me from one to the other. We may be here a while. There's a much more detailed 3-part series on this on the Patreon, where I'm just talking mainly through the issues involved, and those are going to come up tonight, but I'm also going to be talking about how my own experiences led me in this certain direction and away from Trotskyite practices, shall we say. So, other point of order, shall we say, or a couple of points of order before we begin. First of all, be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already, and be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel on this if you haven't done so already. Always helps with the numbers. So, final piece of housekeeping is that I've decided to make most of the live streams on the weekdays start at 10:30. For various different reasons, it just works better for me in terms of a start time. I'm always free at this time in the day, and I find that essentially the audience is, to be blunt, slightly bigger on the 10:30 start time. So I think what I'm going to do is that on the Monday through Friday from next week, I'm going to be starting at 10:30 in the evening, and I think on the weekends what I'm going to do is do like an early morning show or a mid-afternoon show for the European market, shall we say, and do the same on Sundays for people who don't want to go to church, and then back to 10:30 onwards in the weekdays. That's just the time that seems to work best. I think flipping back between the two just creates a bit of confusion where you don't really need it. So having it in a Monday to Friday 10:30 p.m. slot, I think is just going to work a lot better. So with that in mind, and given the fact that I have the customary giant cup of tea on the go, it's probably time to do the customary walk through the chat greetings. So let's see. We've got Seabolt and Any Sundry Mule who seem to drop in early, probably due to time confusion. So I hope you can make it again. Adam Marks says, good to see you again, and greetings to you. Good evening to non-Trotskyist comrades, says Solaruity. Otis, salutations back to you. Matt Randazzo, who says, greetings international comrades. Adam Marks says, I think that every trot organisation in Britain is assigned to a section of the working class. What's your opinion on that? I think you're vastly overestimating them to imagine that any of them interact with the working class. That's a slightly humorous response, but I think once I get into the issue, you'll see why it's based in a certain reality. Trotsky the Splitter, says Otis. Indeed he was. Good evening to Jenny, and good morning to Banana Bender, who's already in tomorrow. And Matt Randazzo is enjoying the new music. Banana Bender says, is Indonesia just elected another comprador, this one with official massacre bona fides, however? Well, the US does like to pick reliable men. So just goes to show you cannot rely on the supposedly democratic system, though I'm told that the military regime there that has a strong influence behind the scenes picked this guy. I haven't done enough research into the chicanery of this election, though, so we'll probably end up commenting on the Indonesia situation over the course of the weekend. CJ, who says, greetings from Richmond, just started the How the Steel Was Tempered, a Soviet novel. That's excellent and in English. Also working on banners now. Good to have you with us, comrade. Good afternoon to Carlos Chavez in Nicaragua. Good to have you with us. Where are we now? Leo Nomelini, apologies if I've mangled that, can just see the average workers in Idaho, Wisconsin, etc., tuning in and saying, yes, this speaks to me, damn it. Well, I think you vastly underestimate the average worker, Leo, to be blunt with you. You don't know what the average worker's tastes are. You're just projecting yours onto them. Never underestimate the intelligence or the perceptiveness of the working class. And Albert Roundtree, who says hello, and we say hello back to him. Good evening, comrades, says Red Star Betty from the good green hills and valleys of Durham. Good evening to Roddy, and Dan Lindstrom is joining us. Ian Foster, good evening to you, comrade. Comrade Hello Hi has joined us from the Democratic People's Republic of East Anglia. I think he was the title there. Jenny is stoked for this one. Well, glad to see you are. Then we say hello to Jawad in Poole, Dorset, who feel like have found me a home here on this channel. Well, glad to provide one. Arnold says Trotsky is a total fraud. Well, if only I could have learnt that 20 years ago. Potted Rodent, interesting name. Good evening to you. James Graham, good evening to you. Albert Roundtree says Zed. Solaruity says, funny way to put it, stay away from Trotskyist practices, kids. Yes, just say no to Trotskyism. Evening to Martin over there in the US of A. And we've also got Unused Sub, who says, I'm a socialist in Alicante, Spain. Do you think I should support Valencian nationalism, or is it a fool's errand? The Podemos movement is dead, as is Mas País. I know it's very popular amongst the British left, probably influenced by Orwell the Rat, to see Catalan and perhaps Valencian nationalism as a way forward. I would pose questions rather than give you a definitive answer, Unused Sub, because you're on the ground there. You will clearly have a much greater knowledge of the political situation within Valencia and how it relates to the national Spanish situation. But I would say two things. First of all, when judging these things, as Stalin says, he outlines in his book, The Foundations of Leninism, when you're looking at things like the rights of small nations to succession, to secession from a major country, or the right of regions to greater autonomy, independence, etc. The question that needs to be asked is, firstly, is this going to actually take the cause of the proletarian revolution, the redevelopment of class consciousness and class struggle? Is the cause of Valencian independence going to advance that? Is the first question to ask. I think a lot of people look at like Catalan independence in particular and have a very romanticized notion of it. So the question that if I was in your position I would be asking is, well, does it take the workers' struggle forward in Valencia? Does it take it forward in the rest of Spain? Is this likely to do anything positive in that regard? What is the character of the Valencian nationalist movement at the moment? Are there strong proletarian elements in there that are worth at least relating to and communicating with? Or is it a movement dominated by a regional bourgeois, as from my impression of it, the regionalist Catalan movement was under Carles Puigdemont, when they ran that independence ballot and then ran away from the result and fled to Brussels in some cases. In Puigdemont's case, fled to Brussels. So that wasn't a movement that was particularly militant. It was a movement of the regional bourgeois who were just looking to essentially do what is done in Scotland, which is just have up there. It's like a petty bourgeois layer vying for more power to get more power and a bigger budget from Westminster. So again, ask the question: what is the character of this movement? If it is to succeed, what would be the character of an independent Valencia? Again, would it improve the position of the working class there? Would it lead the working class in a revolutionary direction? Or would it put up an unnecessary barrier to a Spanish-wide working class movement that would need to be something that would be necessary to stand a chance of actually taking on Spanish capitalism, and beyond that, of course, U.S. imperialism, which dominates, or at least is a power that leans heavily upon even the bigger EU nations. So also bear in mind this, that the regional bourgeois in a lot of countries, when they start talking about independence, it's often independence in terms of being a nominal independence, but within the EU. And also dominated by NATO. So is this independence anything other than just an exchange of flags, given that if you were an independent nation in the EU, if Valencia was an independent nation in the EU, you wouldn't control anything fundamentally? So again, these are all questions that have to be interrogated. Is also the breakup of the Spanish bourgeois state. And I was having this discussion with Comrade Michael, the Polish comrade whose program I was on the other week. And he made a point, which he's made commonly, including by some of the Trotskyite groups in Britain. I'm not saying that to insult anybody, it's just a fact. That the question of Scottish independence came up, and I explained why I'm opposed to it. I don't think it's a progressive move. And one of the arguments he made to me, and this is an argument that comes up a lot, is, well, it would weaken British imperialism. And my response to that was, well, will it really? Given that we know that an independent Scotland, if it is achieved, will be one that is run by a petty bourgeois nationalist party who are already committed to being in NATO and to being in the EU, or to being aligned with NATO and to being in the EU, well, that's already essentially put them firmly under the control of US imperialism. So again, how does that take the working class struggle forward? It's not just a question for me as a communist who lives in and is active in Britain of looking to weaken British imperialism wherever we can by depriving it or standing in solidarity with those who seek to deprive it of its markets that it exploits for its to reap its super profits from overseas. But also we seek to weaken it internally by strengthening Britain-wide working class struggles, which of course is always a difficult one to wage when you've been on the receiving end of so many defeats. I think too many people, and talking this is purely in the British case, see Scottish independence particularly. Welsh independence, I think, is a different thing. I don't think there's much enthusiasm for that as there is for Scottish independence. Too many people on the British left see Scottish independence as a shortcut to some kind of revolutionary process. I don't think that is the case. I don't think there's any objective measurement of things which can take you in that direction. You could say, oh, we're heightening the contradictions. Okay, so we heighten the contradictions, but we do so with minimal levels of organization, tiny levels of organizations of actual communists in the working class. So we've made the situation worse, but we're in no position to actually do anything to develop it. See, these are questions which you have to ask. I mean, I am not going to say one way or the other as to whether you should go and support Valencian independence or not, because, again, you know the situation on the ground. I have not interrogated that situation enough to actually venture an opinion one way or the other. I am merely recounting what I've looked at in terms of the Catalan movement and what our own experience is here with the Scottish nationalists. So, again, I think you hint at this in your question. It's not just a question of saying, I'll break up the Spanish state. Well, okay, what does putting these barriers between the Valencian working class and the rest of the Spanish working class do? does that take things forward? And I don't think it does. I think people get desperate in a long period of defeats, in a long period of reaction, which we've been through, and they start supporting things which look as if it's going to essentially, give a shock to people. Wake them up is a cry I always hear. Okay, but which side of the bed are they going to get out of? How are we organized to take advantage of this situation? These are all assessments that have to be made. Right. Banana Bender says, how do so many Brits on the left get attracted to Trotskyism? I've seen more Trotskyist groups there than anywhere else. We will come to this. Where are we now? We'll have to come up with a DPR flag design. What do you say, comrades? Good point. Flag competition time. Good evening to you, Wan. Wayne Table says, good evening, friend. How do you assess the challenges facing advocates for Irish unification, especially Sinn Féin's position on the EU and increasingly Sinn Féin's position on NATO? Look, the reunification of Ireland, even if done under the purely capitalist plans that Sinn Féin now have, would be undeniably a progressive event. And it would be a blow to British imperialism to finally evict it from the occupied 6 counties of Ireland. So and that's of course a long-running case of naked colonial oppression which the Irish have faced. So even just the removal of the British occupation forces there would be a step forward. It would remove at least one contradiction facing the Irish liberation struggle. However, then you'd be faced immediately with another problem, which is, of course, the fact that, again, if Sinn Féin are the ones running the show, you're then going to be locked into treaties with the EU, which is, of course, dominated by German and French imperialism. British imperialism will still retain a heavy influence in terms of trading relations, and, of course, there's no guarantee that the British ruling class won't succeed in some of their plans to cancel out Brexit as well, which of course make the trade that British imperialism does with Ireland even quicker to do. But also that the American imperialism will insist upon certain things if Ireland is to be unified. Like it'll insist, most likely, that Ireland joins NATO. I think that'll certainly be something that, if not Biden, then whoever succeeds Biden will say, unless, of course, Trump gets in and accidentally detonates a bomb under NATO and destroys it, which would be hilarious. But the question over Irish unity, of course, then flows directly into a struggle for, well, what kind of republic do you need, do you want? And Irish capitalism, of course, even under unified conditions, the Irish capitalist class have proven themselves over and over again to be totally incapable of taking the Irish nation forward into a truly independent state. So it would have to be a rapid move over into a struggle for an Irish socialist republic, as the great James Connolly once dreamed of. So the whole question has to be addressed in terms of yes, the unity and the removal of the British occupying army from the north of Ireland is going to be a step forward, but it's a step forward into a more intense struggle, which is that the struggle will then have to be against the new set of national oppressors who will take over the role from British imperialism, which they'll be led by US imperialism, which already has a lot of investments in the Republic of Ireland and exerts a degree of political control there. The British still exert a degree of control over the Dublin government. Hopefully that would be weakened if they were removed from the north for good. So this is the question that opens up before us, that the removal of partition, positive thing, but then that struggle would have to immediately begin essentially against the Irish capitalist class and the other imperialist powers who would then seek to subordinate a newly unified Ireland to their rules-based international order, as they call it. The advantage that the Irish may have is that, of course, that the British and the US imperialists and the German imperialists are all on the way down now. slowly but surely. There's a long struggle to go, but they have been weakened. And so it may provide opportunities, if Ireland is to be reunified, for the renewal of that struggle for a socialist republic with facing less powerful imperial adversaries. So there are bright spots on the horizon for the Irish struggle, even though many Irish comrades will, of course, be feeling that they are swapping the British for the American imperialists. I know that many Irish comrades in the South feel that the domination of American imperialism there is quite strong, especially through its NGO presence. But undoubtedly it would be a step forward. However, a step forward into another bigger struggle. Right, where are we now? Jenny comments, Albert, absolutely, it's perfectly allowed and encouraged by capitalists in order to render you useless and far away from Marxist-Leninism. Very true. Mary says, I know about the Catalan independence movement. They're all liberal Democrats. They have no intention of changing the capitalist state. They revealed that when they ran away from their own referendum. Hello to C. Bolt. In my opinion, they just want to turn Catalonia into a tax haven. Well, that's what the SNP wanted to do to Scotland. Remember that the banks are in Catalonia. Yeah, and a lot of the industry was, I'm not sure if it still is, but a lot of the Catalan independence movement was based upon the fact that the Catalonia was the most industrially developed part of Spain, and the bourgeois there wanted to get themselves a better deal, or thought they could get themselves a better deal. Tom says, English comrades suffer from great national chauvinism in regards to the breakup of Britain, sorry to say. Well, Tom, I'm sure that you will not be surprised to hear that I completely disagree with you upon that point. I would ask you, in return, what is your analysis as to how Scottish independence would take the class struggle forward in this country? I do not see any way that it can. And what would Scottish independence mean for the Scottish working class? Because under the current balance of forces, unless things dramatically change in the near future, which who knows, if it changes, I'll reassess. But at the moment, it looks like Scottish independence is only going to be delivered by the Scottish National Party, who, again, their only plan is to turn Scotland into a tax haven, run by a very parasitic group of capitalists whose only plan was to enter the EU if the Spanish would even allow them, and to fully back NATO. So how does that take things forward? I have never seen, to this day, a convincing argument as to how that does anything positive, other than the argument that Comrade Michael put to me, which is that it breaks up the British state. And that's an argument that I don't regard as convincing. If you have arguments that you wish me to consider, feel free to email them in and I will discuss them. Didn't UK Labour purge all the Trots too? They said they did, but strangely enough, they keep coming back, you know? Potted Rodent says, well, to be more serious about Jenny's question, the Trots in the Labour Party keep turning up because the Labour Party never really expels them. They expel a few every now and again. And then what happens is that the Alliance of White Liberals, the AWL, the most enthusiastic imperialists in Britain, even more enthusiastic about wars than the ruling class themselves sometimes, and the way in which, of course, the IMT, who have now rebranded themselves as the Revolutionary Communists, they've rebranded themselves after another Trot group that became ultra-conservatives. So the reason why they keep coming back is because the Labour Party most of the time doesn't see them as that much of a problem. In fact, they're quite good for business in that they often lure people who don't understand the Labour Party and its role and don't understand Trotskyism into the Labour Party and get them working for the Labour Party. And if you're doing that, you're an agent of the Labour Party and you're an agent of social chauvinism and social imperialism, to be blunt. Right. The SNP equals Brits in kilts, traitors, says James Graham, very definitively there. Albert says, I don't believe that the UK should be broken up. Again, like it's an assessment that we make based on an interrogation of the class relations, which is it the case in Britain that we have the chance to advance the class struggle by breaking up the country as it currently stands? The answer, I don't think, is yes. And again, if that if a compelling argument emerges or a new set of forces emerges, then you have to reassess your evaluation, as Stalin urged us to. But at the moment, I don't think that the case is there, that it would be a progressive move to do such a thing. Hello to Tusker, who's joined us, and Klavek, who's joined us. And Comrade Hello Hi says, Leon Sedov brigades in the Syria moment. Yes, well, there were certainly many oddly named English brigades turning up in Rojava a few years ago, many of whom, as I've said before, ended up in Ukraine fighting for Azov. The New Revolutionary Communist Party was called a renaissance by Alan Woods. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he, given that he's the leader? Well, Tom says the people of Scotland believe it should be broken up. Well, depends which opinion poll you look at, and also the last popular vote that they took went in the other direction. I mean, you can say that the bourgeois played every advantage they possibly could against it. But again, I think a lot of that vote back in 2014 in Scotland was, it scored pretty high. 45% voted for Scottish independence. And I think a lot of that had to be understood in the context of the fact that a lot of Scottish working class people, especially younger people, did vote for that, thinking that it was a good chance to essentially tell the London-based, distant, despised political classes to go fuck off, which, I entirely understand that impulse. And at the time, as a Trotskyite at the time, I fully supported Scottish independence because I wasn't actually analysing the situation, speaking personally. And the party I was in took a wholly opportunistic stance towards it. Unused Sub says, Valencia is actually one of the wealthier communities of Spain, but hospitality workers like me make about €1,000. I would love to unite with workers in poorer communities like Extremadura to strike. Okay, so is it the case then that the Valencian independence movement is what, the Valencians capitalists who are behind this, who are wanting to essentially bargain with the Madrid government, maybe get themselves a better deal, more autonomy, etc.? Again, I don't know enough about your situation to make a firm judgment. Hello to Kent in Minneapolis. Jawad says, or asks rather, thoughts on Tariq Ali, if you could please. Followed Tariq for some time, but got tired of him for many reasons, for being an ultra-elite bourgeois, feels like. Would love to hear your thoughts on him. Well, I met him once, many years ago. To be completely fair, I mean, reading his books on the history of Pakistan did teach me a few things. 22 years ago, when I read his book, The Clash of Fundamentalisms, that did provide me with some interesting information. Generally, though, well, I tell you what, Joe, I will come to your question more thoroughly when I finish going through the comments here. Yu Wan says the bourgeois state is inherently anti-worker. As such, secession increases the exploitation by the local bourgeois through its marriage of imperial bourgeois. Good point. Leon said brigades fought for a certain group with a black flag. Comrade Hello Hi, I didn't know that. But it doesn't surprise me, given some of the things that the Trots have supported over the years. Tom replies to me and says, Scotland and England are real countries. Britain is a fake country. Well, this is the thing. I'll tell you what, I'll finish your comment first. Marxism-Leninism takes a national form. Scottish Marxists have been fighting for national liberation for a century. Some Scottish Marxists have. Yes, that's true. But then again, okay, well, how do we establish this then? Is there now a unified working class across Scotland and England? Would be my question to you. I mean, I would argue that the British Union of Crowns, so to speak, goes back at least 400 years. So we've been unified now, unofficially for 400 years, officially for 300 years. That's quite a long time. Now, you can say that Scotland and England retain slightly different cultures. Yeah, that's true. There's different cultures also in different regions of England. But do we have now, and have we had for a while, a unified working class? You could argue that the working class inside England and Scotland isn't very unified at the moment. But I don't see what putting a further division in there does to take things forward. But now, as Tom says in his next comment, we are potentially derailing here. So I'm prepared, of course, to discuss this further. If Tom, an unused sub, and others want a discussion of this question, or the question of independence in the era of decaying imperialism, perhaps, that's certainly something that we can look at in future streams. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to the question of Trotskyism, given that it's half an hour in and we've traditionally now digressed. So, first things first, refresh the tea. So, the question of Trotskyism then, why to discuss it? Why bother discussing it? Well, unfortunately, as others have indicated in the chat so far, it's not an abstract question. It's a question that's actually comes up repeatedly in the in Britain, because we've got, as someone else indicated in the chat, one of the most horrific selections of Trotskyism anywhere in the world. Perhaps because we are an imperialist country and Trotskyism has been relentlessly promoted. And I notice we've got the Trotsky to Bill Kristol and Irving Kristol pipeline question coming from Tusker. I'll deal with that in a moment or two. So the whole point here is that Trotskyism is promoted in nations like Britain, and I think it's been promoted by the ruling class through the anti-Stalin, what the historian Grover Furr refers to as the anti-Stalin paradigm. And when you realize that a lot of what the anti-Stalin propaganda that floats around in the bourgeois press and academia, a lot of it stems from two sources. And this is even before Khrushchev's so-called secret speech of 1956. It comes partly from Trotsky and all of the wild claims and outright lies that he came up with in the 1930s. And the other part of it comes from fascism. It comes from claims made by the fascists in Germany, of course, in France, in Italy, but also, of course, in Ukraine, the Banderites, etc. And a lot of this was combined together into Khrushchev's so-called secret speech, which is in reality a disgraceful surrender document that he attempted to deliver to imperialism, which, as we've covered many times before, kicked off an then 35-year-long process of a counter-revolution which reached its horrifying climax in 1991. So Trotskyism is promoted. It is promoted certainly by the British ruling class, and it's promoted because it provides something very useful, which is takes the form of left anti-communism, which has been discussed. I know that Gabriel Rockhill, the Marxist academic, has discussed it many times. Trotsky provided this service to the imperialists in his work in the 20s and 30s. But before we get into that, I'm going to answer the autobiographical question first, when it relates to the popularity of Trotskyism in Britain, or the promotion of Trotskyism in Britain, which is how did I get into it? Now, I got into it all the way back initially in 1999 when I was 17. It's a long time ago now. And I first started reading Marx at the age of 17, not in the form of any actual Marxism that I read, but I read what was essentially a comic book it's called Introducing Marx by it was written in the 60s, I think, by a Mexican Marxist cartoonist who went under the pen name of Rius, R-I-U-S. Let me know in the chat if you read it. I would still, by the way, recommend it, especially for teenagers, because he actually did an excellent job, having revisited it recently, of outlining core Marxist concepts in a way that was actually quite accessible for me at the age of 17. So he goes, for instance, into like the labour theory of value in there, and he explains how you as a worker are exploited. I remember being 17 and trying to explain this to like the other lads on the shift at the co-op that I was working on. Nobody understood it at the time. I was probably explaining it all wrong. But that's the first book on Marx that I read. Then I read a similar book in the introducing series, these were, about Lenin. And I forget the author, but the illustrations were done by a guy called Oscar Zarat, Zarate. Forget the guy, the writer of that particular book, but those are the first two books I read, and then I kind of got, I was a bit of an obsessive teenager, so I went on this sort of binge of reading these sort of introducing Marxism texts, and I remember the Lenin book didn't really answer the question, sort of left it open as to what happened after Lenin died, and to backtrack briefly, I'd started calling myself a communist from the age of about 15. I had no idea what it meant. I just had this idea in my head that life would be better if the prices for everything were fixed, and that then they wouldn't keep going up. That was like where the idea came from, and I thought that must be a communist idea, so I started calling myself a communist, partly because of that, partly because I wanted to seem edgy, which is the curse of every teenage boy, I think. And I also, hilariously, I thought this was really profound at the time. When we were signing each other's yearbooks in our final weeks at high school, I put in the yearbook of a girl I had a certain, shall we say, attraction to. Dear Anna, I'd love to see you in the communist future. I thought that was like a devastating, devastatingly both witty and perceptive. She sort of just sort of looked at it, scowled, and walked off. So clearly, the impression I was aiming for there just didn't work at all. But so I was attracted to the idea of communism, even though I didn't know what it was. I read these initial books. Then I came across a book on Trotskyism in a second-hand shop, actually, and it was by Tariq Ali, and of course, Tariq Ali, to draw on the question that came in earlier from Jawad, is a very famous intellectual writer, sometime politician, sometimes not, who's very much an accepted part of the bourgeois intelligentsia here. And I think that's undeniably true. Tariq Ali is a regular, or certainly was a regular, on Radio 4, which is the channel for the sort of bourgeois wannabe thinkers in Britain. It's those who like to think they're in touch with the news, though, of course, if you ever listen to the fucking thing, you'll go mad in about 10 minutes. But Tariq Ali was, of course, also involved in the founding and the original programming of one of the big British TV networks, Channel 4. He's done documentaries that have been featured on British television. So this guy is presented to us as the big-time revolutionary. The Rolling Stones apparently wrote a song about him, Street Fighting Man, because he was involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests in the late 1960s, including I think he was involved in the Battle of Grosvenor Square, where the student radicals engaged in a pitched battle with the Metropolitan Police. The Rolling Stones, apparently, Mick Jagger wrote a song about him, and of course Tariq Ali was an associate with John Lennon for a while. So this guy's like the big celebrity revolutionary in this country. And so, naturally, I knew who he was. So I picked up the book on Trotskyism, and I found, bear in mind, this is 1999. I started reading Marx, the Rias book. I picked up the book by Tariq Ali must have been the early 2000s. So I'm 18 when I'm doing this. And the whole scope of this sort of has to be bear in mind, because this is only 10 years after the final collapse of the USSR, for those who if there's any younger viewers out there who weren't quite around yet. So this is still very much in the period of capitalism triumphant. 9/11 hasn't even happened yet. The Iraq War certainly hasn't happened yet. So we're in in the period of total capitalist triumphalism. We've got the god-awful maniac Tony Blair as prime minister in this country. The trade union movement is, if not dead, then dead from the neck up. So this is not a good time to become a Marxist, you might think. So, but then the way that Tariq Ali presented this, and of course he presented it in a skillful way because he is fundamentally he's a good writer. He writes good propaganda, and he presented it in such a way as, well, you see, the USSR was this potentially wonderful innovation, but then there was this power struggle just after the great Lenin died, and the evil one, Ivan the Terrible, but from Georgia and with a mustache, came along in the form of Stalin. And he was jealous of the great Trotsky. And being an uneducated Georgian peasant rube, wanted to destroy this great man and seize power for himself and his bureaucratic clique, etc., etc. I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with the arguments. But the appealing thing about it, the way that Tariq Ali presented it, was that, well, if only Trotsky had become the paramount leader of the USSR and been able to enact his ideas, then everything would have been all right. So the attraction for yourself, for me, as an 18-year-old who's not very familiar with Marxism, by that stage I'd read the Communist Manifesto and not understood it. But when you try and going around calling yourself a communist, you, of course, inevitably run into the objections. So what about Stalin killed, whatever number Solzhenitsyn came up with last time? It was 800 billion people or something. He killed everybody in Russia, apparently. And, it all leads to blood and death and all that. And, of course, once you get a little bit more educated, you can trace all of these lies back to stuff that, again, came out of, well, Trotsky, but also the fascists, and later on, the Information Research Department of MI6, staffed by such luminaries as George Orwell and Robert Conquest. And once you find out about that, you can't unsee it. But at the time, I didn't know any of this. And to me, Trotskyism seemed to be a really good way around this. It was like saying, yes, all that happened, all that bad stuff that you say happened, well, yes, it did. But it's only because this guy wasn't in charge, only because the bad man, Stalin, his bureaucratic clique rose to the top and, of course, destroyed everything. So it's an easy answer, particularly if you're living in a country like Britain at the time, which was one of the strongest anti-communist countries. Even of course, the Social Democratic Party we have here, the Labour Party, is like a massively anti-communist party. It's also a very chauvinistic party, and a pro-imperialist party. So, and as are, by the way, the hierarchy of all the trade unions. So you have this collection of circumstances which makes Trotskyism an apparently appealing alternative, an appealing radical alternative that's clean, that doesn't necessitate all the difficult conversations that you have to have about where you have to unpick all the bullshit. And of course, it just seemed so easy at the time. And of course, that's why it's presented in such a way. It's also why, you can have celebrity Trotskyists like Tariq Ali, like Paul Mason, like certain members of the SWP, who are media figures, who are regulars on the British in the British press. You don't get many Marxist-Leninists being regulars in the British press. You do, however, get Trotskyites, and you get also revisionists in the form of people like Rob Griffiths gets on the news every now and again, and other members of the so-called Communist Party of Britain. So all of these characters get on the news, and they get promoted in bourgeois academia. They get book deals. Again, revolutionaries don't get that. So this is something which is deliberately promoted, and the bourgeois don't make mistakes when it comes to who gets promoted and who gets relegated and ignored. It's no coincidence, of course, that with regard to the party which I'm a member of now, I'm very happy to be a member of, CPGBML, the party's name is very rarely mentioned. Even when our comrades got arrested, they didn't even mention the name of the organization. So this is part of the reason why, of course, that people get lured to Trotskyism is because it's promoted all the time by the bourgeois, because left anti-communism is very, very useful for them. Now, I stayed as a Trotskyite through, it was a brief excursion into anarchism in about 2003 for about 8 months. Didn't really work out. British anarchism, if anything, is even worse than British Trotskyism. British anarchism is one of the most reactionary political traditions that you could possibly imagine, other than British Maoism, which is utterly bizarre. But we'll have to do a whole other program on that. So I stayed, broadly speaking, I had a brief excursion to anarchism, decided that was even worse. Joined a Trotskyite group in the form of the Socialist Party of England and Wales, or SPEW for short. And I then got involved with their union caucus in the PCS union between 2011 and 2015. So that's about 4 years in total. It was rather dramatic 4 years, given that the public sector was being cut back relentlessly, the union was under attack, and the Trotskyites leading it were in this sort of strange coalition with a bunch of centre-lefts. And basically what they did was, I mean, let's be clear, trying to lead a militant struggle of civil servants who literally serve the state isn't the most favourable set of conditions to be in at the best of times. But what struck me was that there was always a huge gap between the sort of raving revolutionary statements that the Trotskyites would make and their actual practices inside the union, which, even if you're in a difficult position inside a trade union, which operating as inside a trade union as any kind of committed Marxist would be difficult at the best of times. But if you are operating inside a union, even if you're aware of all the limitations of trade unionism, which is, of course, there are many, they are limited organizations by their very nature, then you have to engage with the question of, well, how do you best operate? And you can at least do things like trying to extend trade unionism into areas of the workplace that are unorganized, trying to adapt around the maneuvers that the bosses are making. So they were making use in the public sector of large amounts of casualized labor, agency staff, etc. So why not lead campaigns to try and organize them? Because clearly the work needs doing. So why not do something about it? Why not try and get these workers into the union and try and get them better contracts? It's a minimal, what you might call a minimal set of demands. And the Trotskyites in charge of my union and others always said that they were in favor of this, but it was very rare that they ever actually did anything about it. I mean, mainly what they seem to do is to focus on winning office for themselves at the higher levels of the union every year, retaining a degree of control over the bureaucratic structures, and that was about it. The industrial strategy ceased to exist after a while, and we ended up basically just operating like we would have been if we'd have been in the Labour Party. And there was no attempt to forge a more Marxist path. There was never any attempt inside the union group to carry out any Marxist education. We had people joining the party caucus in the union who not only weren't Marxists, they were barely even socialists. They'd just been brought in because they were friends with somebody. So this is the kind of level we're operating on here. And that pointed to a problem with the wider party, which is that its political education process was basically non-existent. They weren't even talking about Trotsky even back when I joined. I mean, occasionally they would like write something about him. But in the party I'm in now, now I'm a Marxist-Leninist, of course, there's we do weekly study of Marxist classics and interrogate them and see if there are still lessons to be learned from them and whether they still apply and raise all relevant questions. None of that was ever done. And I was in one of the bigger branches in the country. We never went through any political training. The only political training that the party members in Manchester ever got was that which I and some other comrades organised off our own back. That the full-timers, of which there was 2 in the Northwest, were never interested in politically educating any of them. What they were interested in is having people who would go out and sell their paper, and that's about it. Now, of course, selling a physical paper can be an important task if you're taking a paper with something useful in it to workers. Not that there was anything useful ever in the rag that we were selling. But again, never actually educating their members properly, politically, and operating in the unions in a way that was always designed not to actually radicalize workers or lead workers in a more class-conscious direction. The whole question of like how they operated in the unions is very telling, because what their aim was not to do anything involving leading workers in a more militant direction or helping workers to organize by adopting more militant tactics, extending trade unionism to unorganized groups. No, what they wanted to do in every union was not do that. What they wanted to do was to secure influence within the existing union bureaucracy. That's what they wanted to do in every union. I mean, you examine the tactics that they, not just them, but also other trots as well, used to use inside Unite, the biggest British trade union. It was all about not doing anything with the workers especially, but securing influence with key leading bureaucrats. Because if you secured influence with the leading bureaucrats, well, you might be able to funnel some union funding towards that perennial Trotskyist favorite, a front group, which is what the stars of this, the absolute masters of it, are, of course, the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain. So the Trotskyite tactics in the British trade unions, and I'm sure it's the same in the United States, was all about influencing the bureaucracy, gaining a place within the bureaucracy. Now, if you know how trade unions inside imperialist countries work, of course, they are dominated by the higher paid levels of the workforce, and that is who supplies the trade union bureaucracy roles. They are the people who get recruited to run the unions. So the question of like, well, why are the Trotskyites so obsessed with just influencing the bureaucracy or finding a place for themselves within the bureaucracy? It's because fundamentally the Trotskyites aren't actually interested in building support for Marxist positions, building support for communism within the working class, because generally Trotskyites, certainly their leaders, tend to come from the petty bourgeoisie or the labor aristocracy. So what they're interested in doing is essentially participating in those layers of the labor movement and competing for influence within that. They're not interested, as Lenin clearly pointed the way towards in 1916. They're not interested in going lower and deeper into the masses, which is what it takes to actually do if you're trying to organize in an imperialist country, and the trade unions are dominated at the leadership level and the higher level by this layer of the labor aristocracy. So none of the Trotskyites were ever interested in going into the masses. What they were interested in is retaining an influence at the top. And that gives you a very clear idea of what their agenda is. It's to be an official institutional part of the British bourgeois state. And when I say an institutional part of the bourgeois state, what I mean is that there is an acceptable way in which you can be a revolutionary in Britain. And you, as Tariq Ali's career shows, you can be a self-described revolutionary, have a column in The Guardian, have your own journal, which is published in the form of New Left Review, which is published every other month. You can be an acclaimed writer. You can be an acclaimed journalist even, like the late Paul Foote was. And not to insult him as a journalist, the man broke a number of very important stories. But again, like, this shows that Trotskyism is regarded by the British ruling class, who are, if nothing else, very long and practiced at knowing what is a threat to them and what isn't, and what they can absorb and what they can't. And they clearly identified Trotskyism as something that was going to be very, very useful for them as soon as Trotsky started practicing it. So, the other point I wanted to cover tonight, though I realize we're probably going to have about 3 sessions on this again, is that when you actually start to look at the way in which the great examples of the great hero Trotsky that people like Ernest Mandel hold up as being this great example of why he was a hero, they're actually the opposite. So, for instance, first job that Trotsky had after the October Revolution was as Commissar for Foreign Affairs. And he was sent by the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party to negotiate a peace treaty with German imperialism, because, of course, one of the things that the Bolsheviks had promised to the working class and the peasants was that the war would end. Because, of course, the Imperial Russian Army, the army of the Tsar, had fallen apart completely. Kerensky and the Mensheviks and the social revolutionaries had tried to continue the war because they were the representatives of the Russian bourgeois, who were completely beholden to British and French imperialism, who both wanted the Russians to continue the war, to essentially act as bullet stoppers for the German guns, so that those German guns wouldn't get to march west and be aimed at Britain and France. So, a key factor in the Bolsheviks winning over the masses was to say that we will end the war, and that this was a task that they set, and the Bolsheviks sent Trotsky to go and negotiate with German imperialism. And his mandate was, you have to sign a peace, that we can't continue fighting this war. Your instructions, as democratically decided upon by the party and endorsed by the Soviet power, is to go and secure a peace treaty with German imperialism. Trotsky went there and disobeyed the instructions. He went there, he gave a speech telling the German imperialists that they were all swines, and he wouldn't sign a treaty with them, but the Bolsheviks wouldn't continue the war. Unsurprisingly, the German imperialists saw this as an opportunity to launch further attacks. And Lenin, furious, had to order Trotsky essentially to go back and to essentially had to countermand Trotsky's performance and sign a much worse peace treaty, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with German imperialism that enabled, of course, the emergence of a German imperialist puppet regime in Ukraine and lost the Bolsheviks significant territories that might not have been lost had they signed the original treaty with German imperialism. So Trotsky, and this is held up as him being a great hero by both Tariq Ali and Ernest Mandel in their books on the man, is portrayed as an act of great revolutionary heroism, whereas in actual fact he was violating his mandate given to him by the Central Committee and of a policy that had been endorsed by the Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants' deputies across Russia. So he was violating all of that so he could grandstand and make a point. And as the point about Trotsky is that, as Lenin said frequently prior to 1917, he would always go back and forth between ultra-left and sort of right-wing opportunistic tendencies. He would do a load of grandstanding and a load of ultra-left language one day, and then he'd be compromising and selling out to the opportunists the next day. And as Stalin observed, the two are very much interlinked together, because it comes from fundamentally a petty bourgeois class position. Trotsky was, of course, the son of a medium-sized landowner in what's now Ukraine, and his politics always reflected that. His politics were that of the petty bourgeois radical, who's constantly bouncing between a more pro-bourgeois and a more proletarian position, but it each time takes a sort of hysterical turn. So it's hysterical ultra-leftist or it's hysterical defeatism. And that is what distinguished Trotsky all the way through his career. So by disobeying all of his instructions in a wholly undemocratic manner, he risked the German imperialists destroying the revolution entirely. Now, the Trotskyites don't like to say such things. So the other thing that the Trotskyites cite as him being a great hero is, of course, his organization of the Red Army. Now, of course, he was involved in the organization of the Red Army, no point denying that. But it wasn't, of course, solely him. There were many other Bolshevik leaders involved in the organization of the Red Army. He was instrumental in setting up certain elements of it, and he did lead battles from the front. It was quite a good use of his skills for a couple of years. But Stalin was also heavily involved in the Civil War as a military organizer. Read his reports on the defense of Perm, for instance, which you can find on the Marxist Internet Archive. Zizinski, the founder of the Cheka, was also heavily involved in the organization of the war. So to claim, as the Trotskyites do, that it was all him, the great genius, again, is historically inaccurate. Then, and we're running through the big hits now, we get to his position on the trade union question. Trotsky, and even Mandel has to admit that this is a terrible position that Trotsky took on this question, the question of the trade unions. Trotsky argued that the trade unions should be commanded by the state in the new Soviet republic. Stalin and the majority on the Central Committee argued the opposite case, that the trade unions should remain not controlled by the state and should remain free of, should be mass organizations of the workers that weren't directly controlled by the state, that the workers should retain bargaining power. Trotsky wanted to essentially, as Stalin said, run it in the manner of like a Prussian general. He wanted to essentially militarize the trade unions, which is not what you would expect if you believe that Trotsky was the great visionary, the great lover of freedom against the bureaucrat Stalin. You read this debate, it's the opposite. It's Trotsky who again lost the vote on his position in the Central Committee. Then he went, so the Central Committee voted for the policy on the trade unions that Stalin was an advocate for. It wasn't just Stalin, it was the majority of the Central Committee. So under the terms of democratic centralism, Trotsky and all the members of the Central Committee were bound to go out in public and advocate for the policy that the Central Committee had voted on, which is the policy on the trade unions advocated for by Stalin. Instead, Trotsky goes public and declares his differences with the Central Committee and essentially breaks democratic centralism, publicizes the fact that there's differences between them at a time when, of course, the young Soviet state is sort of striving to maintain its unity and to keep discipline, and that is being the only way you stand a chance against all the imperialist armies of intervention if you, of course, retain a disciplined and unified approach to work. Trotsky just threw that out of the window and went around shooting his mouth off about how he was being suppressed, how he was being cheated, how there were people conspiring against him, and that's why he'd lost these votes, and it was all rigged against him. Again, he lost a vote because his idea was bad, and he advocated for it in a hysterical way that didn't win anybody over. And then he broke party discipline, and he violated the central concepts of democratic centralism by going out and going public with these differences when he had no right to under the grounds which he joined the Central Committee. So again, what's presented by his advocates as sometimes as being the great independent-minded man was actually just a petty little moron who couldn't accept when he lost a vote. And this carried on all the way through the 1920s. Trotsky advocates for positions. There's a vote on it, either in the Central Committee or at the party congress. He loses the vote. He flips out and goes public. And again, this is at a time when the Soviet power is not secured. It's not, we're pre the 5-year plans. We're still in the period of the new economic policy. Still in the period where there's still capitalists and there's still kulaks around. And there's a class struggle in the countryside and everything else that's going on. So Trotsky at each stage forms oppositional groups when he's already lost a vote, tries to conspire constantly to try and overturn party decisions that have been made through the democratic processes that the party has. And again, like every time he loses a vote, he does the same thing. And eventually, of course, the party gets sick of it, strips him of his positions, and sends him and eventually kicks him out of the party when he tries, I believe it was 1927, to organize anti-government rallies in Leningrad and Moscow, calls people out onto the streets to oppose the government after he's lost another vote again. And again, this is at a time when nobody goes to these things. Very few people actually turn up for them. But it's at that stage that the party has had enough of him. Like, he has had many chances in the period before Lenin's death to rectify his behavior, but he always behaves in the same way, which is advocates for something, goes to a vote, he loses the vote. He continues to agitate out in public, breaking all party discipline. He then conspires with other members of the Central Committee, such as Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had also been on the losing side of arguments, and tries to bring them into a conspiracy against the party's leadership. So this is he can't accept that he's been on the losing end of things. And if you read something like the position of the the platform of the United Opposition, I believe that you can get that off the Trotsky Internet Archive, off the main Marxist Internet Archive, and it's the platform upon which the unified opposition of Trotskyists and Zinovievites stood in 1927, I believe. And it's actually it's great to read it because it's completely filled with lies. Like, Trotsky claims that I'm losing the votes because the proletarians in the party are being replaced by petty bourgeois layers, and I'm just being too damn proletarian and revolutionary for them. The actual truth was the opposite. The actual truth was that Stalin, as general secretary, far from trying to fill the ranks with bureaucrats from the middle layers who would be loyal to him, he's actually working flat out to bring more and more layers of workers into the party. And it's the workers who vote against Trotsky's proposals time and time again. Trotsky's advocates later claim, of course, that he was a visionary who saw the need for mass industrialization before Stalin did, because he was advocating for it in 26 and 27. And, of course, the switch to the 5-year plan didn't occur until like late in 1929. So what goes on there, though, is that Trotsky advocates for positions too early, which is that the argument of the Central Committee over the ending of the new economic policy was that, well, we need to get to a point where we've essentially had to indulge the capitalists and the kulaks to redevelop the productive forces of the country that had been completely shot to bits, literally, in the Revolutionary War against the whites and the foreign intervention armies. And until we've built up the country sufficiently, we can't just switch over into a further wave of industrialization and collectivization. But Trotsky was advocating for that to happen immediately. It had to happen now. Whereas Stalin was saying, well, we must develop to a certain point, then we can go into it. And so it was a question of, again, Stalin in all of his writings and all of his political practice was constantly looking at the political situation and the economic situation and evaluating, well, what is going to be the right moment to move into industrialization? What is going to be the right moment to liquidate the kulaks as a class, so to speak? And of course, this is also influenced by the class struggle inside the country. There's certainly a class struggle in the countryside of the peasants versus the bigger kulaks. And that is partly of the process that influences the collectivization process. Trotsky just sort of ignores all of that. And all of his followers follow in this sort of same vein, which is that they keep shouting and screaming slogans in the hope that one day they'll be right. They don't evaluate situations. They don't interrogate. They don't, to use the Chinese phrase, seek truth from facts. They put forward slogans and then scream hysterically about them over and over again. And eventually they hope that they will be right. So when you examine why Trotsky ends up first in internal exile, then thrown out of the Soviet Union entirely, it's for these reasons. Consistent failure to accept the rules upon which the party operates, consistently trying to undermine the party out in the open, consistently lying about the party's position and his own position, and then trying to advocate for anti-state, anti-government demonstrations at a time when the country's under siege by imperialism. Every single time it comes down to Trotsky being essentially a petty bourgeois egotist who can't accept discipline and then when discipline is imposed upon him because of this, cries and screams and wails that he's this big victim. So what actually comes out when you examine it is, yes, an eloquent man and a good writer, certainly a good writer of prose, but a man who has essentially allowed his class origins and his egotism to drive his political judgments, and who wasted his considerable intellect upon petty rivalries and hysterical reactions to merely having to behave as every other party member had to. And of course, this made, once he was out of the Soviet Union, and once he was then sort of a roving, free radical, so to speak, this, of course, brought him to the attention, of course, he was already known to them, but brought him to the attention of the various different intelligence services of the British, the French, the United States, and, of course, the Germans and the Japanese, who were all more than happy to use this buffoon, this egotistical buffoon, who placed his own pride before anything else, in the service of their conspiracies against the Soviet Union. And of course, Trotsky always declared that he wasn't running any kind of underground operation in the Soviet Union, which is one of the things that his followers were accused of in the Moscow trials. Turns out years later, thanks to research by a Trotskyist, Pierre Bruet, into the Trotsky archives, which are, by the way, the Trotsky archives, I believe, are all owned by the Hoover Institution, one of the big think tanks of U.S. imperialism. So it turned out that he was running an underground inside the Soviet Union, jointly with the Bukharinists of the right wing, who had also been thrown out for behaving in roughly the same way in the later 1920s, early 1930s. So again, a compulsive liar, a man who routinely misrepresented himself, and also, and this is something I didn't believe when I first read it, was the allegation that he was a collaborator with fascism. Now, even after I'd accepted that Stalin had been on the right side of all the policy debates, I still found it hard to accept that Trotsky would be that degenerated to actually collaborate with the fascists. But lo and behold, it turns out to be true, and you can establish this actually through Trotsky's own writings. One of the things that some of Trotsky's associates were accused of, and you can read this in the book by Harpal Brar, Trotskyism or Leninism, where he goes into great detail about the fact that some of Trotsky's followers in Ukraine were actually Banderists, or not Banderists. Bandera wasn't a thing at the time, but they were Ukrainian fascists, Ukrainian separatists, the precursors to Bandera and the precursors to those charming characters who are empowering Kiev right now. And again, go back and read on the Trotsky Internet Archive Trotsky's writings on Ukraine in the 1930s. What is he demanding there? He's demanding that Ukraine be separated from the Soviet Union. And he's hiding behind the phony allegations that Stalin was deliberately starving Ukraine in the early 1930s. Now, we've covered this before. There's an old episode of the Red Star Radio podcast that I did with Comrade Slava from the Revolution Report, where we go through the Holodomor mythology and point out that it's largely a confection. There was a real crop failure, not just in Ukraine, but across many areas of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Agricultural collectivization was designed to prevent such things, and indeed it did for many, many years. It only went wrong towards the end when it was deliberately sabotaged by the Gorbachev leadership, but that's another story. But collectivization was, according to research by even American academics, was designed to and did solve the repeated starvation problems that had afflicted the Russian Empire in its earlier decades. And there was famine on average once per decade, going back many, many years back into the 19th and 18th centuries. Collectivization solved that and made sure that there was enough food for the proletariat and peasantry to actually live off. And the collectivized system still managed to serve the Soviet Union well, even during the horrors of the Great Patriotic War, the horrors committed by the Nazis. and the attempt to starve the Soviet Union that they committed. So Trotsky, using this fake story, which he must have known was a fake story, it was run by the Hearst press at the time, uses this to justify the call for the immediate separation of Ukraine from the USSR on the grounds of Stalin's oppression, which again, not true. And again, is also not supported by the facts in that the Ukrainian workers and peasants overwhelmingly fought on the side of the Soviet Union and joined with the Red Army or the partisans. Only a very small minority joined Bandera and Shoikovich in fighting for the Nazis in World War II. And that's because the Ukrainian proletariat and peasantry overwhelmingly supported the communists in Ukraine and the dictatorship of the proletariat, which even though there were difficulties with the peasantry, was, of course, a big step forward in terms of their collectivization, in terms of the life of the peasantry overall did improve. And they're fighting furiously for the Red Army in World War II and for the partisan movement in Ukraine demonstrates that. So think about what Trotsky was demanding. Trotsky was demanding that the Soviet Union be broken up in the 1930s. Again, go on the Internet Archive for Trotsky. It's all on there, assembled by a Trotskyist, by the way. He calls for it in no less than 3 articles towards the end of the 1930s that Ukraine must be separated from the USSR. Of course, he dresses it up. He declares that it must be separated, and it must still be socialist, but must be separated from the USSR. Do you know who'd go on to make that argument later on? A certain fella called Leonid Kravchuk and others who collaborated with him, who at certain points would declare that they wanted that Ukraine would separate from the USSR, but it would still retain elements of the socialist system. It wouldn't be purely capitalist. It would be this sort of wonderful social democracy. Well, the Ukrainians got capitalism full-bloodedly, as it turns out. Then, as it would have been back in the 1930s, what they would have ended up with, had Soviet rule been destroyed in Ukraine, would have been a coming to power of the either, if not Bandera himself, then certainly characters who would have equally been a stooge of, at the time, German imperialism. So, again, Trotsky is openly advocating for the destruction of the Soviet Union by the end of the 1930s. So, judge from that what you will. A poor political judgment motivated by opportunism, or part of a deliberate strategy to essentially give a Marxist gloss to a fascist demand. I go with the latter, to be completely honest with you. So, we've had a number of comments come in, so I'm going to pause now to go through this. I haven't got anywhere near through what I wanted to get through tonight, but this is the risk when you open up a big subject like this. So, where did we get to? A lot of people have had various things to say. Where are we now? Where are we now? Where are we now? Right, I'm going to have to do... Okay, so hopefully I've answered Jawad's question about Tariq Ali. Right. Seabolt says, back on the nationalism question, that it's more popular with people under 40 in Wales. The country is a net exporter of food, water and energy. Interesting. This is okay. The nationalism questions, you know what? I'm going to come back to them on another night. So if I skip over your comment, it's because clearly we need to do a separate program on this. Again, email me at the usual address if you want to make any comments on nationalism that you want me to consider. Synthetic left, says Ian Foster. Trotskyism is at the heart of the synthetic left. Produced clowns like Paul Mason. Yeah, you can be a Trotskyist and you can be editor of you can be economics editor of the BBC's Newsnight program. Right. Comrade Hello Hi says, I honestly stumbled on the USSR and communism on the internet one day. It's more easily done these days. Albert says he wants to use the chat up line. Well, it didn't work for me, Albert. You give it a go. Maybe it'll work out better for you. Comrade Hello Hi says Riz, and I actually know what that means. I had to look it up the other day. Mary says her loss. Well, thank you very much. Solarity laughs at my teenage story, as rightly so. Ogham says, better sentiment than getting communism's future back. Yes. Wayne says the only two Trotskyites I give the time of day to are Michael Hudson and Norman Finkelstein, and Norman doesn't really count because of how narrowly focused most of his stuff is. Yeah, I mean, I think Finkelstein's described himself as a Luxemburgist. I haven't read his book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. Yeah, he's described himself as a Luxemburgist before, which is like sort of Trotskyism, but even more esoteric. But yeah, I think for a guy like Finkelstein, his work is so mammoth and so significant on the Palestine question that his Trotskyism doesn't really come into it most of the time, or his Luxemburgism, I should say. Michael Hudson, I mean, again, his Trotskyism doesn't really manifest itself except for when he actually comments and makes like the usual Trotskyite bollocks statements about Stalin and the USSR. Harry Price says, okay, well, Harry, I'm going to come back to the nationalism question another day because we've got to focus on Trotskyism. All right. Okay. Solaruity says, at 18, I also believe this narrative because Trotsky looked cooler than Stalin. I mean, I disagree these days, but maybe that's as a result of my political development. Comrade Hello High says Trotsky had the military aesthetic. He did in the early days. Stalin was rocking the pipe mustache and quality jacket combo, though. You can't argue with that. My only defense is that I was 18, says Solidarity. Well, that's also mine. Matt Randazzo says Carlos Garrido's Purity Fascist book makes many of these points. Yes, and I spoke to Carlos about that a while back. Very interesting discussion. General Russophobia in Britain rivals the US. I think it might be worse here in certain areas anyway. Jenny says CPGBML and puts the cool sign up. Very wise choice. D says Trotskyism has always been weak in Turkey, but pro-PKK groups and some of those who call themselves Maoists are effectively Trotskyites. It's hard to tell the difference between Trots and other left libs. Well, that's because they're basically the same. The Maoist thing needs another episode to itself, and it looks like we're going to need to do another one on my own autobiographical journey here. But yeah, the Trots also take the wrong line on a lot of the national questions. I mean, their attitude on the whole Syrian war was disgraceful, as was their attitude on the Libyan war. They were in favor of both. They didn't come out, most of them didn't come out in favor of it, but what they did was their usual thing of saying, well, we agree with all the points the imperialists are making, but they shouldn't bomb. Well, if you agree with them that Gaddafi is a genocidal maniac, then why are you opposing their actions? Again, like they made all the running for imperialism, but just pulled back and sort of balked at the actual military campaign. But they repeated all the lies of imperialism about Gaddafi and about Assad as well. I'm in the US, says Lisa, so forgive my influence, but how would you describe George Galloway? I would describe him as a political adventurer who would never have left the Labour Party if they didn't throw him out, basically. I know that he has a lot of people think favorably of him because he's had some great moments. He's going to the US Congress and telling them to fuck off. Everybody could admire that. Telling a former Labour cabinet minister that Labour is responsible for 1 million deaths in Iraq. Everybody enjoyed that. My issue with him has always been he remains a Labour Party left-winger even if he's not in the Labour Party and retains all of the weaknesses that brings with it. So even though people enjoy him saying, fuck you to, Norm Coleman back in the day and destroying Christopher Hitchens in the debate, which is, everybody likes seeing that. When he's had the chance to build something, the couple of times he's won parliamentary seats in Britain, and he may win another one up in Rochdale, who knows? It's never led to anything long-lasting. And there needs to be a question asked as to why that is. Wayne Table says Stalin refused to condemn Hamas and beheaded 600 billion babies from 1925 to 1926 alone. Ah, yes. And you can read this exclusively in this week's Socialist Worker. Tusker says, have a party meeting. We'll have to watch the rest, comrades. Later, comrades. Well, have a good meeting. Don't know which party you're in, but I take it it's a good one. Mary says, I have not heard much from Trotsky. However, I notice most people are happy to mention Marx but not Lenin. And without Lenin, Marxism never materializes into action. That is, of course, a product of if you're in Britain, that's just a product of the anti-communism of the British left and the British trade union movement, of course, which is all promoted by the ruling class. Alan says, if you go to the Marxism section of the famous City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, California, there's a shelf of books by Trotsky and Trotskyites, of course, no books by Stalin. Alan raises a good point there, and of course, Trotsky, his work, along with various famous Trotskyites, is available in the corporate book chains in Britain. If you go to the big corporate book chain in Britain is Waterstones. If you go in there, you'll be able to find books by, of course, celebrity Trotskyists such as Tariq Ali and Paul Mason. Even though Paul Mason doesn't call himself a Trotskyite anymore, he still basically is. And, of course, you can find that rat George Orwell in there. But also, you'll find various books by Trotsky quite a lot of the time. You'll find books by, you'll even find old Adolf himself in there. Who will you never find? You'll never find Stalin in any corporate book chain. Yes, you can get some of Stalin's work these days through Amazon because other Amazon marketplace sellers put it on there. But it's still nowhere near as widely available as Trotsky is. Trotsky's work gets republished very regularly by Verso, of course, the big leftist publisher here and in the United States. Stalin, I mean, you can still get collected works done by Stalin. I think you can get them from various Indian printers. I think the CPGBML Party Shop has some of these available, but it's hard to get hold of printed copies of Stalin's collected works these days because, of course, I think the Soviet Union stopped printing them a long time ago, and Chinese did print runs probably until the 70s, I think. So again, like other than the Indian communists, I don't know of anybody who's still doing these. I think Iskra Books in the United States have done a I've got the first sort of volume that they did a reprint of, but again, like you have to ask the question, why is it that the ruling class, even the ones who run the giant corporate book chains, actively want you to buy books by Trotsky, and they never put anything by Stalin on there other than like, you know, stuff by Robert Conquest or Simon Sebag Montefiore? Again, it's not by accident. It's not because there's no curiosity. It's a deliberate choice. They don't want you reading Stalin. I mean, they publish a little bit of Mao's work. Verso republished on Practice and Contradiction with, of course, a gigantic and verbose and garbage introduction by Slavoj Žižek a few years ago. But again, Mao mostly never talked about. They will occasionally have stuff by Lenin in the corporate book chains, but very rarely. So again, just ask yourself the question. If Stalin was the horrendous mistake and the horrendous evil that everybody from Vladimir Putin to Solzhenitsyn to Bill Clinton will tell you that he was, then why on earth are they so afraid of you reading him? Same with Mao. Ogum the Bald says, I mentioned PCS during my sit-down protest at work health program yesterday. I had to break in. Okay. Michael Hudson is all about debt, but the working class as an economic power, historically, he doesn't say much. It's an accurate observation, Dan. Corbyn is a Trotskyist, says Bullflex. He certainly was. He was associated with the old International Marxist group, which is, I believe that was Mandel's group in Britain. He and his brother Piers both used to write for their newspaper back in the late 60s. It was a newspaper called Red Mole, I believe. The Trotskyist to guy who takes his shoes off on planes pipeline. No Stalin, no defeat of the Third Reich. Good point, Bullflex. Imperial Commander is lolling at Wayne. Organ the Bold says, Unite were too scared to give me a list of exploiters they deal with. Interesting. Independence of Scotland. Divide and conquer the crony capitalist bourgeois, says Harry. Okay. More nationalist talk there. We'll have to come back to that. Cobra Commander says, Trotskyists talk a great game, but it always ends up with them defending the status quo. Curious. Yes, I'm reading Ludo Martin's book, The Velvet Counter-Revolution, at the moment, and the amount of Trotskyites who were actively involved in the counter-revolutions of 1989 in the Central and Eastern European countries is astonishing. But actually, it's not astonishing. They were very, very actively involved with like the most heinous reactionary anti-communists going. Have to ask why. K667 says, my superficial take is that Trotskyism sounds like a first attempt to make a leftist PMC. Also, they seem to want to avoid actually dealing with the economy. It's like about just the narrative. Well, it's about screaming a lot of slogans and looking radical, but actually not being anything of the kind. Slava says, it would be interesting to know the stats on how many MLs came through Trotskyism and how many avoided it. I think the Trotskyism to rabid reactionary pipeline is a much broader one, Slava, to be honest. Trots are like our AOC squad. They pretend they are socialists, but really they want you to use proper channels, says Cobra Commander. That's true. The only time I thought anything positive about Trotskyites was during the 80s in Liverpool City Council, Hatton et al. Militant struggle against Thatcher. I knew zilch about what Trotskyism was back then. Yeah, I think it's worth saying, as Ian's comment suggests, also, most of the people involved in that struggle, in the militant struggle, yeah, there was militant tendency were a Trotskyite group in the Labour Party in the 80s who did organise a struggle of the Labour Council against the Thatcher government, and they got a lot of popularity out of that. But a lot of the people involved in that weren't ideological Trotskyites. That's the one thing to say. The other thing to say is, of course, again, once they were kicked out of the Labour Party, they died a death, withered away very, very quickly. So Trotskyism, even at its most successful, was a flash in the pan. Comrade Hello Hi says, I was never a Trotskyist. I literally praised Stalin before any other communist. Well, you did better than the rest of us then, or many of us. Cobra Commander says, I didn't even like Trotsky or Makhno when I was an anarchist, and I was an ANCOM for like 3 years. Good stuff. Martin says, I think a lot of the academic Marxists are trots, including ones I respect and study. Weird, but I suspect that it's because being trot is a safe way of being a Marxist in that context, and Martin is exactly right about that. Search and Research says, I avoided the Trotsky trap thanks to you and you, Slava, and Alex. Many thanks. Well, glad to be of service. Search and Research. Cobra Commander says, one day I just got tired of my peers blindly hating Stalin while simultaneously saying communism good. It was something I could no longer stand by. To defend Stalin is to defend communism. Exactly right. Red Star Betty says, I was first exposed to a pro-Stalin POV by my uncle, who used to shout at the TV during the expenses scandal and say Stalin had the right idea. He wasn't even a communist. People get radicalized by the system's decay, Red Star Betty. As long as they stick to political economy, they can do valuable work, says Martin, with reference to the academics. Cobra Commander says, Paul Robeson really inspired me once I learned about his life. Being proud about being a Marxist-Leninist was easy. Very good point. Paul Robeson was one of the all-time great Americans. James Graham says, all the trots I know lie off the dial. Very good point. They're following in the tradition of their founder. Cobra Commander says, it's proof Trotsky didn't even pay attention when he was in the Bolsheviks. Literally for decades, they've just fought a revolution to secure workers' rights. This guy, the state, and laughs. Tusker is back. Thought that was going to last longer. Very efficient meeting. Ogden the Bold says, my 1984 college physics prize, which included basic atomic stuff, didn't help me being forced to dig for food by Thatcher. Yes, well, no, the Thatcher regime respected nobody. I haven't read Domenico Lazzardo's most famous book on Stalin yet, says Dan. The big leftist P in Sweden, a party I used to be a member of, don't understand Stalin very well. Well, most of the Western leftists don't understand Stalin very well, nor do they understand that all the social democracy they love so much was only possible because of the existence of the Soviet Union as a dictatorship of the proletariat, of which Stalin was the general secretary. So all the social democracy that they harp on about was only made possible because the ruling class was terrified into making concessions by an existent dictatorship of the proletariat. It's starting to look like the unions are just an extension of human resources, says Otis, as it seems more and more alignment with the employer, but very slowly, as the PCS has fucked us with the collaborative roster. Yeah, I noticed that during my time, Otis, to be honest. One of the reasons I quit was because essentially my job had become an adjunct of human resources. Because human resources had cut loads of jobs, we ended up as trade union reps actually just picking up the pieces and doing their old job alongside our day jobs. So again, it was just a way of, in the end, the employer squeezing even more out of us. Jenny's missed last 5 minutes, the internet cutting out. Leon set up brigades, says Comrade Hello High, apparently also has a presence in Argentina. Are they backing Milei? That would be typical. For some reason, democratic centralism seems to be a huge problem for the petty bourgeois. They can't stand being subject to the majority. Yeah, because, and this is from Tusker, because, again, following their founder, they cannot accept that they have been outvoted, and their egos are too big to allow the reality that they have been politically overruled by the majority to get in the way of their need to assert themselves. So, especially if they've been outvoted by workers, if they've been rejected by workers, they really lose the plot. And again, they'll invent absurd things, like Trotsky inventing this whole thing about how he'd only lost these votes because Stalin had filled the party with bourgeois elements, despite the fact that Stalin was actually doing the opposite, that he was working to get more and more workers in the party. And that's what made the party really strong in the 1930s. And it's the wiping out of a lot of those the most class-conscious proletarians by the Nazis in the Great Patriotic War that helped pave the way for Khrushchev. Trotsky invaded Makhnovia, says Comrade Hello High. Only good thing he did. Right. Ian Foster says Trotsky was an entitled, egocentric child who could not accept that he did not become Soviet leader. A revolutionary without discipline is a lost cause. A revolutionary without discipline is just an adventurer. And there's only periodic uses for such people. Right, where are we? Okay, you know what, Otis? We're going to have to do a trade union episode at some point soon. Cobra Commander says, I think that's the bigger picture. Trotsky started out as a leading figure in the revolution, but ended up meeting FBI agents in Mexico for McCarthy. Yes, indeed, he did. Jenny suggests an ice pick might be the solution here. Indeed, it was. Killed by his own followers, or one of his own followers. Did I know that Trotsky was supposed to be at the House Un-American Activities Committee? Yes, I did know that. He was supposed to go there and actually meet them. I'm not sure. I don't think he did, but he was supposed to, and he did meet with representatives of like the earlier version of HUAC. I think it was called something else back then. But yeah, he was involved in anti-communist witch hunts inside the United States. He was involved in aiding them. He was going to testify against communism and expose Marxists in Mexico, but his visa was denied. Can you imagine Robeson versus Trotsky? Can you imagine Robeson winning that encounter? Communists cured the famine, says Jenny, and that's correct. US loves fascists, says Potted Rodent, and that's also correct. And yes. You know you're a total badass doing great things when motherfuckers have to lie and slander you this much, with reference to Stalin. Jenny's comment is correct. Slava says Trotsky naively believed that the Ukrainians would love him for all that, but they still despise him. Yes, indeed. All that service to capitalism, and the Banderas still won't put up a statue to him. Maybe that's something that Paul Mason can get in on. He should go over there and suggest that Zelensky builds a statue to Trotsky. Soviets couldn't have foreseen the return of capitalism. Well, Stalin did foresee it as a problem, a potential problem. He said that if the Soviet Union goes down, it will usher in a period of the blackest reaction. And, well, here we are. We're coming out of that period, but it's been 30 years, arguably longer. D says some of the Trot groups in Turkey famously supported Erdogan during the 2010 constitutional referendum, leading to the further destruction of the country. I didn't know that. I'm not surprised, but I didn't know that. The Trot groups in Britain pretended to be viscerally opposed to Erdogan. I mean, what the hell was their reasoning? I didn't know that. Jesus. And Wikipedia goes all in with the Holodomor myth, says Dan. Yep. Read the studies by Mark Tauger that are available through the Debunking Anti-Communism page on Reddit, one of the few useful Reddit pages. Trotsky wanted to break off parts of the Soviet Union and floating the idea of a united Europe. Both serve imperialism, says Ian Foster, and that's very correct. Janet says, some Trotskyists I know say Ukraine has a right to self-determination. Comments? In brief, Ukraine lost what little sovereignty it had after the US organized coup in 2014. After that, what little sovereignty it had was sacrificed, and it became just a US puppet regime. Its self-determination was denied, actually not by the Russian Federation, but by the United States and its puppet regime. So, yeah, self-determination would be good if they ever really got a chance to it. I mean, even the establishment of an independent Ukraine was actually done in defiance of the votes of Ukrainians who wanted to keep the Soviet Union going. So every time the Ukrainians have tried to assert any kind of national self-determination, like in all the elections in the 90s when a huge number of Ukrainians voted for the Ukrainian Communist Party, the reading I've done on it suggests that Kushma and others moved heaven and earth to make sure that the Ukrainian Communist Party didn't come into power. So, like, every chance the Ukrainians had at any kind of self-determination was destroyed by the imperialists and their puppet regimes. Finkelstein was a Maoist, says Jenny. Interesting. Michael Hudson is a Trot. Must not have heard enough from him, says Potted Rodent. Tom's enjoying the stream, despite our disagreement on the Scottish national question. We will return to that, I'm sure, in the subject of fraternal debate. Stalin was way cooler than Trotsky, says Jenny, making an accurate observation. Frank asks a question. Please forgive my ignorance. What is the difference between your party and... You mean Jyoti Brar? Jyoti Brar is actually the vice chair of the CPG-BML. Comrade Hello High answers that. Somewhat odd that in the UK socialism is acceptable, but communism is absolutely hated. Certain social democracy is accepted, sort of, because of the long influence of the Labour Party, but yeah, I mean, there's been anti-communist hysteria in Britain before, but Communist Party used to have a lot of influence in the working class. It wasn't the biggest party, but like even as late as the 70s, it had like about 20-odd thousand members, I think, and a lot of workplace branches. Had a lot of influence in a lot of key industries. So I think the anti-communism is probably more widespread now, but back in the days of what's referred to as the Cold War, communists actually had a good deal of influence, certainly in the trade unions in Britain. Ogden the Bald says, my debate with nationalists begins in 1066 and ends with a demand for 60 million acres back. Interesting. Are you fighting against the Norman yoke? Perhaps we all should. The Ukraine question does reveal the right-leaning tendencies of supposed leftists, says Potted Rodent. Very true. Indian communists are some of the best, said Comrade Hello High. And check out the Indian farmers movement that's kicked off again. Jack Straw refused to pardon the burned witches. His hobby is burning books. Well, are you surprised with an ex-National Union of Students president? I was looking at the CPG-BML shop yesterday, and today most of the books are published in India. Yes, they are indeed. Based India, shall we say. Okay, I've jumped too far ahead there. Adi Kravitz says, hi from US guy in my 20s, learning a lot, breaking from all the lies of the West teaches. Well, good to have you with us. The Naxalites are still operating in India, and there is also a group in Nagaland which have a Maoist and Christian ideology. Interesting. That's from Comrade Hello Hi. Bleer, interesting name, says anarchism in teens through punk rock, syndicalist after that, reading a little, and ML after reading more and growing up. Many such cases. Bleer. Jawad says, your take on Slavoj Zizek and Tariq Ali is the same as mine. Also, please note that Tariq's work on Pakistani politics is very basic too. Well, it's an area that I need to read more on. I said I learned a fair bit from his work on Pakistani politics, but it's not an area I've researched a lot. It will be something I have to read up more on in the future. Muzzle Paint says, I must confess I was an anarchist in the late 90s and early 2000s. Then I met some Leninists in Atlanta in 2003. They fixed/educated me. Jawed enjoyed Slavoj Zizek's Pervert's Guide to Cinema. I saw that but can't remember anything about it. Slavoj Zizek is Hillary Clinton with sniffles. Very true. Cobra Commander says, I use a website called Stalin's Library. There's everything. It's quite refreshing. Reading early Lenin and Stalin versus everything being 1917 and post-Virian literature. Interesting. Okay. Until 2013, says D or so, Trots, mainly DSLP for Erdogan, would democratize and demilitarize the country. By overthrowing the authoritarian Republican vanguard, they thought Turkey would be an EU member. Well, that's a series of bad ideas, isn't it? And very poor interpretations of what Erdogan was up to. Jesus. I'm not surprised, but I mean, the fact that Erdogan got himself in a pissing contest with the military didn't necessarily mean that Erdogan was going to remove the influence of the military in Turkish society. If anything, he seems to have merged with it. Jenny says, Michael Hudson is actually the godson of Trotsky. He's way more based than most Trots and often doesn't sound like one, apart from occasionally going on about Stalinism. Yes, well, there you go. Trotskyist influence will out itself in the end. Wayne says, self-determination is a meaningless phrase pertaining to the Ukraine question. Japan doesn't even have self-determination. Japan and South Korea have no say over whether their countries serve as US military bases. Well, they have no say under their current regimes. South Korea doesn't have any independence whatsoever. Japan, fairly similar as Wayne's comment states. The only way that they would ever get rid of the United States, in South Korea's case, is if they overthrew the current Comprador regime and started the process of reunifying with the North and were able to remove the US. And Japan would essentially need a revolution to remove the US. The Korea question might well be resolved before the Japan question, though. Okay, right. I'm going to bring things to a close there tonight. Didn't get through half of what I needed to, but it's been a very interesting discussion nonetheless. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in today. Thank you to everybody. And again, thank you to everybody who's made points tonight. It's been a really active and interesting discussion, as it always is, with everybody who's joined the chat. There may be a live tomorrow. It depends upon whether I can get what time my business in Dublin is concluded. But there'll certainly be the interview with Slava on Putin's version of history. So be sure to tune in for that one. It's a really interesting discussion. And I'll be definitely back with you on Friday of this week for a live stream on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So thank you and good night.